Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sheila Bauman, and I'm the events planner for Kitchener Public Library, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's event. Before we begin the program, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. As we gather, we are reminded that the library is situated on the land that is traditional home of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions Indigenous peoples have made in shaping and strengthening this community. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet here and reaffirm our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our community. Thanks to each of you for being here tonight. Just a quick detail about how this event will run. There will be time for Q&A following the discussion, and we invite you to use the Q&A feature to pose your question. And as time permits, questions will be sent to our guests to answer. We wish to thank the City of Kitchener's Imagine It Fund for sponsoring this book launch. And we also want to thank HarperCollins Canada and publicist Cindy Ma for their support of our author events in Kitchener, both past live events and now virtual. Now to tonight's book launch. When we started hosting virtual author events almost a year ago now, we would make our introduction with, this is our third virtual author event. I went back and counted, and I'm thrilled to share that this is now our 11th 85 Queen author event since going online in early 2020. And an important detail that I want to share with you is that our first virtual event last April was with JL, when she brought her Festival of Literary Diversity called Fold Light for our Kitchener Library customers. JL owned and led the event and went live just a month into the pandemic. She and her team quickly taught themselves and mastered Zoom and offered their whole festival online. I appreciate and I thank her for allowing me to watch a professional virtual event and answer my many newbie questions, and I strive to model Kitchener Library's events after JL's format. For tonight's book launch, we're pleased to have Kelly Aiello interview JL. Kelly is a Toronto-based writer. Her work, including book and film reviews, essays, and features, has been published in the Globe and Mail, Toronto Life, eTalk, This Magazine, Room Magazine, and Luma Quarterly, among others. She was a moderator at the 41st Toronto International Festival of Authors, and you can find and follow Kelly on Twitter at KJIello. In January, Kelly wrote a book review of Gutterchild for the Globe and Mail, and we're thrilled to have her tonight here to chat with JL. At this time, I would like to invite Kelly to the screen, who will introduce tonight's 85 Queens special guest, JL Richardson. JL will do a short reading from her book, and Kelly will then join her to discuss Gutterchild. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. I'm so excited. It's going to be the highlight of my year. Thank you to Kitchener Public Library for this event and for inviting me to chat with JL. Her debut novel, Gutterchild, came out January 26th and is already a Canadian bestseller. She is also the author of The Stone Thrower, a book columnist at CBC's Q, and the founder and executive director of the Festival of Literary Diversity in Brampton, Ontario. We already talked about that. Her debut novel, Gutterchild, is a dystopian tale of courage and resilience and arrived with HarperCollins Canada last month. So JL, welcome. I'm so excited to chat with you this evening, and I think we're going to see JL. There she is.
Hello, Kelly. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm right. I'm excited to be here. It's nice to think about being the first virtual event as a moderator and now being here as an author. So that's pretty special.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. And I love that we all have the green theme going on, whether intentionally or not. It feels like this was meant to be.
Meant to be, for
Meant
sure.
to be. So I think that you were going to give us a reading. First off, are you ready for that?
Yeah, so I thought I've read the beginning, and oftentimes people have seen the beginning. It was on CBC, so I thought I'd read a slightly different section. So hopefully people are okay with that. It's from chapter 2. It's just a little bit about in the scene, Elamina's walking around Livingstone Academy with Josephine. And so I'm just going to read a few pages from there. Why is everyone staring? I say after we pass them. People always stare at new kids, Josephine says. I can't imagine anybody's ever met a project kid before. Someone who's lived out there with mainlanders, like a mainlander. Word travels fast around here. Josephine stops in front of a large statue of a man hunched over a cane, his glasses angled down on the tip of his nose. A plaque under his feet reads, Mr. Henry Livingstone, founder of Livingstone Academy, a man dedicated to the growth and development of gutter children pursuing greatness. Have you ever seen such an ugly mug? Josephine says, and for the first time, we both smile at the same time. The only statues in Cape Town were of General Colin Covey, the founder and father of the mainland, whose name appeared all over town. There was Covey Court and Covey Lane and the C1 Covey Overpass, which connected Cape Town to towns all along the Sunset Coast and throughout the mainland. Unlike Henry Livingstone, General Covey was incredibly handsome, as though his sharp jaw, broad shoulders, and black wavy hair destined him to be powerful, as though he was meant to be carved in stone. Inside schools and hospitals and every mainland government building, there were paintings and statues of Covey, featuring his most famous words, "For the greatness of the country." Whenever Mother and I went on walks, mainlanders would say those words with tense expressions, their eyes fixed on me. "For the greatness of the country," they would say to Mother in a way that sounded more like a warning. "For the greatness of the country," she'd mutter under her breath, the last line from that long quotation in my history book. Every gutter man, woman, and child will toil and struggle, and when they succeed, when they rise above their circumstances and redeem their place on this land, we will celebrate their toil and their labor. For the greatness of the country, we will shout. Am I from the gutter? I remember asking Mother. You were born in the gutter, but you live here, Elamina. You are as much a mainlander as I am. Then why do I have this scar? Because you are my special gift. Because you are a gift to all of us. Then why does everyone hate me? I would say. And she would shrug her shoulders and hold her palms up like this was a mystery that we might never solve. The single path that stretches from the back of the main house splits toward 3 buildings beyond the Henry Livingstone statue. The West Hall, where the girls sleep, the East Hall, where the boys sleep, and a large red barn known as the Field House. Josephine takes the center path toward the red barn, where boys in black rubber boots plant flowers and turn soil with sharp spades. Most of the boys work in the landscape and maintenance or agriculture. They spend their days down here in the fields or the field house sun up to sundown, Josephine says as we move down the path. There are a few girls who work down here, but I wouldn't recommend it. Frankly, you don't look like the type. I stare at her, unsure of what she means or how to respond, like she's speaking in a whole other language I don't know. Mr. Gregors will ask you tomorrow about housekeeping or kitchen work, she says. I'd figure out what you want to say sooner than later, or who knows where you'll get assigned. In Cape Town, and in all mainland cities, kids weren't allowed to work until they were 18. When they weren't in school, they could play sports, read, join the band, dance, perform, draw, anything but work. Play now, the billboards read. Although, for as long as I could remember, mainlanders who saw me in the grocery store or walking along the street would say something quite the opposite. You should put that girl to work or she'll get ideas, they would say to Mother. I was never sure what kind of ideas they meant. Guess this is a bit of a demotion for you, Josephine says. Way we heard it when we were growing up is that Project Cases had it all. Lived like kings and queens out there. Hardly, I say, as I kick a rock down the path. Look, I had a hard time when I came here too, Josephine says, but you won't always feel bad. I miss my mom, I say with a small, shaky voice, and Josephine nods like she understands. A tall boy with long arms steps out of the field house, and when he sees Josephine, he smiles and heads towards us. They spread their arms wide and squeeze each other so tightly Josephine's feet lift high off the ground. This is David, she says when he finally puts her down. And this is Elamina. Nice to meet you, Elamina, David says with a smile that's full of crowded, crooked teeth. Even though he can't be more than 16, his face seems grown up somehow, like he's too old to be here, like the rest of us are just kids. In the distance, a mainlander in a security uniform makes his way through the East Hall, with a dog that's pulling hard on its leash, barking and sniffing the ground. That's Mac. I should go, David says with a long sigh. Us too, Josephine says, stepping away with a nod. She pushes me toward the field house, waving me ahead. And when I start down the path, I see David pull on Josephine's arm and whisper in her ear. She smiles, and he holds her face in his hands for a moment, kissing her on the cheek before he goes. When Josephine sees me watching them, she heads toward me quickly and grabs me by the arm. Let's go, she says, squeezing so tight it hurts. Ow, Josephine. Best to keep your eyes, ears, and nose on what you need to know and not what you don't. That's a good rule to follow around here, Elamina, she says. Or this won't be the only pain, you know.
It's one thing, I was just thinking this as you're reading that, it's one thing to read the book yourself, but it's a completely different thing to hear the writer, the author of the book read it. It's just, oh, and now I think, I read it, close to when it came out, and now I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be a book that I'm going to end up coming back to again and again. It's just, gosh. Gosh.
Well, the same about you, so that's great.
Oh, thank you. So I'm kind of wondering, and I was thinking sort of, over the last few weeks that it's been out, and it hasn't been that long. It's not even been a month since the book was released. And it seems like it's been a bit of a whirlwind, maybe. How are you feeling right now?
It is wild. Like, I was just talking to my husband about this before this event, because I was like, this is just the weirdest thing. I think part of it is that I always imagined and hoped that something like this would happen, that I would write a book and people would want to read it so badly that, it just performed well. And I didn't know when I finished Gutter Child that would happen with this book. I really didn't. And so the successes, being on the bestseller list was a dream of mine, but I don't know if you can really believe a dream is going to happen like that, or it hurts too much when it doesn't, right? So you sort of like hope, and you sort of like, yeah, maybe. And then when it really happens, it's just almost too hard to believe. You spent so much time just sort of like pretending you didn't care, or kind of hoping, but not really fully. So I think right now it's kind of surreal. One of the things that makes it hard is I've hardly left my house. So it's not like I've seen it in bookstores, or I drove to my son's school today and the principal was like, it's on my desk, I'm going to read it. Oh, I'm so excited. And those moments I'm like, oh yeah, there's something happened out there. Things are happening. So yeah, it's mostly surreal, and also like a full dream come true.
Right. Do you ever think that that dream will actually settle in, the reality of it will actually ever settle into you?
No, I don't know. It feels like every week that I'm on the bestseller list, I think that's ridiculous. That is the craziest thing that could ever happen. And
Oh,
so
Dale.
like, I haven't looked. People just tell me, because I can't function that way by checking. So when people tell me, and so every week I sort of expect it to be like not on the list. And I think that's when I'm going to be like, yeah, that was a good ride we had. That was a good time we had when it was here. But yeah, no, I don't know if it'll ever really settle in. It's wild.
Wow. Well, I hope it does,
Mm,
because it's well deserved.
Thank you.
It really is. So I know that there may be some viewers, participants tonight who have not had a chance to read the book. Can you give us just back cover blurb?
Yeah.
What is it really? What is it about? Okay, how much time do we have? But
Kelly, this is the hardest question,
I
honestly.
know, and I'm
You asked
so
me,
sorry.
oh, that one.
Like, do you want me to read the back?
So I think the way I often describe it is to just tell like whose perspective it's from. And so, the story, as you heard, is told by Elamina. She is a gutter child who has grown up on the mainland because of a project. You find out early on she was involved in a special project that took her out of the gutter as a baby. She spent her entire life being raised by a mainlander on the mainland. And in the opening chapter, which I didn't read, her mother has died. And so she's landed at Livingstone Academy to try and sort of, because there's nowhere else to go. And so now she's with other gutter children for the first time. And she's trying to figure out what that means. what it means to be a gutter child, whether that applies to her. She only has one scar on her hand, and everybody else at the academy has two. So she's also, when they're talking about a project kid, she's trying to really figure out what that means. And so that's how it begins a little bit. And it's a dystopia. So it's set in an imagined world where, things are not going to be as easy for her, and she's going to have to try and figure out what she's going to do about it.
Right. Was obviously that was an intentional choice to set it in a dystopian world.
I so this book, I started writing this book as soon as I finished The Stone Thrower, the memoir about my father. And I had this burning question from working on the Stone Thrower. I'm working in my dad's real life. I'm working in all the places that he has been and lived, and trying to put together how I feel about the world. And along the way, I meet this guy who's the same age as me, lives in the place where my dad lives, where my dad lived. And he sort of says, "Hey, Chuck, like, my mom, she lived down the few houses down from you. And, she talks about you." And I'm looking at this guy in the projects where my dad grew up and realizing, we've lived two different lives. We've gone in two different directions. And so the premise really came from this idea of like, how that happens. What happens when the world is kind of set up for your failure, which is what I took away from my dad's life. And then what kind of decisions do you make along the way? And how does that make things more difficult or easier or impossible? And so I was thinking through that. And the reason I chose a dystopian setting is because I just totally wanted to get away from reality. I didn't want to have to set it in Chicago in 1920 or Toronto in 1950 and be sort of rooted in the actual places that exist. I wanted to build a system. I wanted to build an entire land and nation. And then I wanted to build it up dysfunctional so that it's going to fail some people. It's going to, my question was, what happens when you grow up in a world that's designed for your failure? And so I wanted to build a system that was designed to fail a particular group of people and then see how they navigated out of that. And I wanted to have my finger in everything, the rules, the laws, the land, the names, everything. And so dystopian just really appealed to me and excited me. And, at this point, I'm like, I think I'll write dystopia forever.
Maybe, yeah. You seem to be good at it. Yeah. Wow. I mean, first of all, there's so many questions from that. And one of them, as a writer myself, I'm like, can you tell me about world building? But we can put that aside for now. I want to latch on to that, building a world. It's still, it probably is because it is a dystopian novel, but it feels like it is a ubiquitous story, right? Even though it is dystopian, we can't get away from that ever. And, nor should we. But I also feel like Elamina Dubois, your main protagonist, she is also ubiquitous. She has many faces. She has many names. She is many lives that, throughout history. I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit on that and who Elamina is.
It's funny when in terms of, and this is a bit of a tie into the world building question, because I think different people start in different places when they're writing a book. Some people start with a character and a voice, and some people start with, a plot or a location. And for me, I started with a question. So that was the question. And then I had to, I built the world, or I imagined what the world might be. And then the big question was, who are you going to follow through that world? Who is going to be the one that you see the world through, even, in terms of point of view? And it was important for me, Elamina, first of all, a woman. I think it was really important for me to navigate this world from a woman's perspective. That's one of the things that I was interested in this encounter with this young man. What was it about his mom's life that gave her, that led her to remain in the projects and led my dad to a whole different circumstance? And I felt like, and you see this in the story, I was very much interested in the women, what was happening to them in this world. So the other thing about Elamina that I think was important for me is that she was a woman who wasn't familiar with the world. She was coming at it at 14 years old, not really knowing the rules. And for me, that's rooted a lot in my own experiences. I felt that at 14, I was just starting to look around and see like, oh, I'm different from a lot of my friends. I'm different from, from my Black friends. I'm different from my white friends. I'm different. And so I wanted Elamina to be different enough that she had to figure out the world and figure out who she was going to trust and who she was going to line herself up with. And so I think Elamina is also a person who's quite naive at the start and sort of comes of age through the novel, trying to figure out what it means to be a gutter child and how she feels about it and what she's going to do about that.
Right. Now, I'm trying not to give too much away here. Um, there's a sense that Elamina's story is unfinished
Yeah.
throughout the novel. I did kind of get a feeling that that is intentional. Is it?
Yeah.
not?
So yeah, no, I mean, it's funny. It's really hard to talk about books and endings without
I
spoilers.
know.
And I'm a big, just don't worry, everyone. I hate spoilers. So I don't think I'm gonna spoil anything. I have always loved like neat and tidy endings, really like relied on them, like romance novels where things work out well and everybody is happy ever after. I think when you're writing a dystopia, you kind of have three choices when you're approaching the ending. You can be pessimistic, optimistic, or realistic. So you can have an ending where it's doomsday and everything is terrible and people learn that the world is terrible and people are horrible, or you can sort of turn the world around for your characters, or you can have your characters sit in what might be more true to life. And so I think I picked a more realistic ending. And I think when you're asking a question about what happens in a world that's designed for your failure, it's safe to say it's difficult. When something's set up for your failure, it doesn't change or fix or adjust or bend back into a right place easily. And so that for me was really important. I finished this book in the midst of, I finished it, I want to say April, May, June, in that time frame. And of course, right then that was, Ahmaud Arbery, Central Park Karen, as we like to call her, and of course, George Floyd. Those were sort of back-to-back instances that were happening while I was writing this book. And so I actually had a tidier ending, I would say. And I wanted to change that because I felt like the world wasn't tidy and I needed to be more honest about and realistic about where we were. And to be honest, I've spoiled this in almost every session I've been in, so might as well spoil it now.
Okay. I don't feel bad for asking it then.
I am working on a sequel. And for me, the sequel isn't just like, oh, like let's make a series and let's make it forever. Just keep it going. Harry Potter. No. It was more for me that I still have questions. I still, even as I'm working on the sequel, it's very much for me, like there are questions that remain unanswered. And I think we're living in a time where there are questions that remain unanswered. So I don't even know what's going to happen with the sequel altogether. I certainly don't know how it's going to wrap up.
Yeah.
But that, Elamina is a character in development and in progress. And I think where the book ends is the right place for it to end. But also.
Yeah. It was, I had to stop for a moment. I finished the book, I closed it, and I took a deep breath and I turned to my husband and I said, wow, she better write a sequel because I have no idea right now. I don't even know. Am I sitting in my home? I just breathe,
Hilarious story. When there was an epilogue, there was a whole thing that happened, and in April, May, June, sometime in their time. What is time these days? I said to my editor, "I'm taking the epilogue out," and she was like, she did just what you said there. She was like, "Whoa,
hold the phone."
And no, it felt right. So I just did it anyway.
Yeah, it was beautiful. It was different. And, even if you hadn't, if you decided not to do a sequel, it would still feel right.
Yeah.
In a way,
And that was one of the things we had to come to a conclusion about. Like, we don't know. I didn't know if a sequel was going to come to me. I still don't know if anyone's going to pick it up when it's done. But yeah, it felt right. When you just sometimes gotta do what feels right.
I was just gonna ask that. Yeah, so you made that decision to do what feels right. Yeah, well, it worked out. It's a national bestseller. And I'm like, cannot wait for the sequel. So, get on that. No pressure.
Like, people are asking, let's finish.
Oh my goodness. I have so many questions about the sequel, but I'm not going to go into that right now. If we have time, I might actually
Yeah.
ask a couple
There will be no
questions.
hints about the sequel. I will tell you that.
I know. Well, okay, but I still have questions.
I know. I know.
um, there's one of the parts, the aspects of the novel that I had to sit and think about for a little while. I probably thought about it for a long while. Um, Not too far into the novel, Elamina learns that Elamina is actually not her birth name.
Mhm.
And then as the novel progresses and as Elamina progresses, as well as how her personality changes, her character arc
Mhm.
moves throughout the novel, she chooses tentatively, and I think that's also, I felt like that was important to note as well, that she chooses tentatively to start using her birth name. um, and this is sort of like a two-pronged question, in that why what was the motivation behind, I mean, your motivation, but Elamina's also motivation behind choosing to, reclaim her birth name. But also, I noticed it was peppered in a wee bit, she wouldn't often correct others when they would use Elamina, even though she would introduce herself as her birth name. um, Questions,
Yeah.
like, what was the reasoning behind all
So
that?
naming is a really big part of the book. What names people use, what names they're given, what names are given by assigned to them, it becomes a really big factor. And I think in marginalized communities, this is really common. How you spell your name, how people say your name. There's all these sorts of things that are really, I think, names and hair are like big things in marginalized communities, in particular in racialized communities. And so one of the things that I mean, even like calling folks gutter children and gutter people, I never refer to them as being Black or being African or being from, some of the words that we might be more familiar with. I wanted to give a word that was overtly negative, because I wanted people to see that that is how we became Black people. That's how we were called Black, not based on a place that we're from, but just based on wanting to be quite nasty. And we've reclaimed that, and we're embracing that. But it's important to remember the origins of that word, and that the way we use the word Black is often not positive, or at least it wasn't for me growing up. Growing up in the church, Black was like sin and bad and evil and demons. And so then I would be called Black, and I was like, I don't know how I feel about that. So even just being called a gutter child is something she has to kind of figure out how she feels about it and what that means. And, the people that come alongside her help her through that. And then when it comes to her name, I think the challenge is when you realize that you've been renamed and you understand that you then have two names, a name that was originally intended for you and a name that you've lived with all your life. You have the question of like, which is more honest, which is, who am I, this name or that name? And to be honest, I think um, in the book, her choice to take on her birth name is really not so much like a thing that I've claimed. At least I didn't see it that way when I was writing it. It wasn't something of like, I'm taking back my name and, very bold. It was more about safety. It was more about, there were other factors that were involved in taking on her original birth name. And so then I think she legitimately lives with two names. And interestingly enough, in the sequel, this is something that I want to unpack a little bit more further, because I want to think about who she is after this, what she actually decides about the name she takes on. And so but I just think names is an easy thing. It's not like, oh, I took on this name because it's more Canadian, and now I'm going to take on the name of my ancestors. Well, maybe that symbol isn't actually something you can type on a computer or something people can say. And so why, what are the reasons that you take on? I was actually talking to a friend recently about even women changing our name to get married, right? The kind of pressure that we have to do that. And then when you take on this new name, you take on your husband's name, um, there's something new that you build, and it's great, but it doesn't always feel the same as the name that you were born with and the name of your family. And there's different things attached to it. And so that's kind of what I wanted for Elamina. I don't think you just take one name and disappear the other, but I don't think you switch back and forth so easily either. And One of the things I was also really working with all of the characters is trying to make them not perfect and smooth, to have them all have, I think almost every character at moments in the book, you don't like what they're doing. And in other moments in the book, you, especially the gutter children and then and the folks from the gutter, I don't think any one character is perfect and ideal. And I wanted that because I think that is a reflection of real life. We're not going to handle any difficult circumstance the same. We're not going to handle it perfectly. And sometimes we're just not going to handle it well.
Yeah, yeah. I thought that the characters were beautiful and they were so imperfect. Um, yeah. So yeah, I was actually just gonna, as you were talking, I was gonna ask, and then you sort of alluded to it, about Elamina's name. Is that something that's going to be explored further in the sequel? Because I was just so, it was her behavior around that, and not, it was an immediate thing. It was, that's my birth name. But then it just sort of started filtering in a wee bit. So I'm interested, and I'm sure you're probably interested in how that's going to unfold as well.
Yeah. And it was tricky too, because I'm like, well, for me, Elamina was always her name. Like, even though I knew she had a different birth name, that was, I mean, when you pick the name your character is going to have for most of the book, it's really important that you like it. And so then, what do you do about that? Do you change it to the name that the other name, or so
Yeah.
that's where I'm at. Oh,
Yeah, it'd be hard to wrap your head around your main
yeah,
character who you've basically been living with for years, and they're always chattering up here to change their name.
yeah, exactly. So
Impossible.
I have to figure out my own, and this is how
Okay.
dystopians work, right? You build a rule, you come up with a premise, and then you got to work your way out of it and in. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So there's one quote in the novel. I mean, there's lots, let's be real here, but there's one quote in the novel, excuse me, that it's like if I read this in high school, like other classics and whatever, and there's always going to be that one quote that you're going to remember throughout your life and be like, yes, this is it. I still remember it. There is one for me in Gutter Child. It is one of the, and I feel like it's an important quote, but it's just, anyways, I'm going to let you answer that. In chapter 19, one of the girls Elamina meets along her journey, Tilly, she says, "Did you know there's a gutter bird, an actual bird that won't ever leave the gutter? Even though the sky is open and even though the walls are not that high, the bird just stays there. They sit on the wall, going nowhere, with feathers that are red like blood." So I flagged it and wrote notes. But it's only mentioned, I believe it's only mentioned once, but I felt like it was just sort of a little flash, even if it was, I don't know if it was intended, but it feels like it was very deliberate. So I'm wondering if you can
Yeah, the
answer a
Gavandri
few of
birds.
my.
So there's actually a lot of references to birds and wings in the book. And I think it's because for me, birds represent the ultimate kind of freedom. Just their flight, their capacity to travel long distances. I don't know. I just think they represent for me freedom. And so this Gavandri bird who sits on the wall of the gutter and they're the bird in the gutter. They're like robins here in Canada, right?
Pigeons.
They're everywhere, but they don't actually leave the gutter. So no one outside the gutter sees them. And so there's another reference to the Gavandri birds very late in the book. But for me, yeah, they were a really important symbol. And I think it was just the idea that even like creation, the idea that even animals could find, could be trapped, could be kept from going beyond. And then also the concept of perhaps sometimes it's not just the walls that keep us in, it's also just the familiarity, the things we've learned that keep us within a particular place that prevent us from being free. So while there are physical limitations, people in the gutter have debt, they have these scars, but there's also sort of the psychological systems that can keep us in a place, that can prevent us from being truly free, from truly moving beyond where we need to go. And so the Glandria birds were really a symbol of that, a symbol. But they were also, I think, for the girls to be able to see them on the wall far away, it was also a symbol of home and the familiar. So there's all kinds of things that for me, the birds represented.
Right. That kind of reminds me of, I think it's in chapter 3 or 4. I have it flagged again. I have lots of flags in this book. Just one line. I think about these words together: enforcing and happiness.
Yeah.
And that, as you were talking, that reminded me of that, that it's an oppressive balance. It's, force, but you have to be happy.
Yeah.
You put on this, you have to put on the face, you have to be meek, you can't fall into the stereotypes, that sort of thing, that are imposed on you, right?
Yeah, and that was the enforcing happiness comes from Lewis, and they're both redcoats early on, and they're sort of told to keep an eye on the other kids and to enforce happiness. And I was really fascinated with Lewis and Mr. Gregors in particular in the opening chapters. I was really interested in the kind of people that work within systems that oppress other people and how they justify why they do what they do. I mean, one of the things that's really important for me is that most people don't believe they're bad, even if they're really bad people. They go home and they believe like they're good people that are caring for other people or whatever, and they make justifications. And so I had to try and figure out, what could someone legitimately say to justify mistreating children, or creating these kinds of systems that are clearly bad for them, but also somehow work. And it's the same when we look at things like child labor and like all kinds of systems that are in place that keep economies moving, and people justify it on the basis of economics. They justify it, pull up your bootstraps is like very common. I was seeing something today about people in Texas and they don't have power, and the mayor was kind of like, nobody should be giving you can figure it out, like work harder, essentially. And we look at those things as evil and people as bad, but in the end, they really believe they're doing good. They believe that what they're doing is right. And so Lewis and Mr. Gregors teaching Elamina to enforce happiness by making sure people follow rules. I wanted it to be real. And I think it's true. I think that's what how people justify rules in schools that are, oppressive. Not wearing hats in school. It's like, it's a sign of respect. To who? To what? Like, how does that relate to respect at all? It doesn't, but it's a rule that people have made, and it's a rule that people enforce. And I had a friend who owned a theater, and she said, we would hear teachers say as kids came off the bus, take off your hats, pull up your pants, as though that was somehow like how you needed to behave in the theater space. And it teaches kids that they're not welcome there as they are, that they have to somehow change and morph. And so there's all kinds of like very normal things that we do to enforce happiness, to enforce rules, and we justify and we just make them seem normal. And really what they do is they make people feel alone and isolated and like they don't belong.
Yeah. And that's the school, that's the academy
Mhm.
in a nutshell, basically. You are lucky to be in the school. And yet
But
the
it's
school,
also a place of good opportunity. People are sending their kids there and they're believing like this is the best option. And, I have so many, my husband's from a large Caribbean family. And so growing up, like my life was pretty typical and kind of boring. And, we had quite a lot of privilege. But as we move forward, I meet so many families where they're sending their kids to Canada while they're in the Caribbean, or they're here going to school while their kids are back home with grandparents because of a better opportunity. And we don't think about how that system is going to affect that entire family, how those choices, that belief, puts some kids in danger, right? Like not from the parents' wishes, but just makes them vulnerable, especially if something goes wrong on either side of that equation.
Right. Wow. Okay. So I kind of wanted to shift a wee bit now. I think we're going to go to Q&A soon, but it's JL time. It's going to be like one of those that you play at a wedding or something. What do you know about JL? No,
good.
well, we can do that next time. So I know that you are really entrenched in the publishing industry now, also as an author, but through your work through the Fold, we had our own conversation a while ago that is just still been going on in my mind about diversity in publishing and the still considerable barriers that continue to exist. And you had mentioned addressing diversity in all aspects of book production, not just the writers and authors. So I'm wondering if we could bring some of that conversation here, because I think that some of those points were really relevant.
Yeah. Yeah, I think some of the work I do with Fold is about raising awareness, and it's about raising the profile of underrepresented authors, but it's also about understanding um, the full economy. Like the book economy has multiple parts. There's librarians, there's the teachers, there's like general readers. There are also people like yourself in journalism, and there's all sorts of people that are feeding and creating a book economy. And the reality is we've started with talking a lot about authors, you know, the diversity of authors really, the diversity of books that are being published, but the lack of diversity at all levels is actually harmful as well. And I was talking with, this is going to sound like a name drop, but we're buddies. What can I say? Lawrence Hill and I were chatting about this, and we were chatting about how, you know, when our books get published, along the way, there's not a single Black person who's looking at our work, which is very much rooted in race and identity politics and the things that we're experiencing and have experienced growing up. And so there's a feeling, and one of the worries I had with Gutter Child, I still do sometimes, this is like me waiting for the ball to drop, is I worried that I hadn't thought things through fully on some level with some member of the community or some groups, and that I would do harm. And I was really worried about that because I also felt like I didn't have people checking that particular angle or noticing those particular things. And so, you know, when we talk about diversity in publishing, like I'm interested in it on every platform, in libraries, in schools, in the publishing houses themselves as reviewers. There's so many things. I told you, like, your review was so thoughtful and so comprehensive. But I had seen other reviews, mostly on The Bad Place, that we will not refer to.
Yeah,
No,
that's for something else.
Goodreads too. And I was just like, I think you know, like I think people miss things, and that's fine. I mean, they're not professionals,
Yeah.
that's fair. But it's just about making sure we're doing a comprehensive look and we're taking care, because, and the reason this matters is I didn't read a single Black writer through high school. I didn't read Black writers at all until I went to university. And in university, when I read them, it changed my life. It changed the game. It's how I ended up in writing. It's how I ended up doing what I'm doing. And so I think, like, what would have happened if I had read it earlier is a question I ask often, but I believe in purpose, and that's fine. It happened when it happened. But then I asked myself, well, what happens to the kids who can't afford to go to university, or where university isn't the path they want to go on? What if they don't have that moment where they find themselves, they understand things, they ask the right questions? Where does that lead them in their relationships and their partnerships and their, you know, communities? And so I'm so passionate about the full range of diversity, because it has to come on all levels. I don't think when you've seen yourself represented in books, you don't know what it's like not to, and you don't know the difference it makes when you're not seeing yourself. And so I think it's really critical on all levels.
Right. Now, I know we were talking, we had our own little conversation. You were telling me a bit about the path and you realizing that, you know, writing could be a path for you. And I think it was through theater. Um, can you just give a little bit of a detail about
So
that?
originally I was a theater nerd. I did plays and I was planning to go to National Theater School. Like, I was pretty intense about it. Worst case scenario, I was going to New York to join the cast of Law and Order. These were my goals. And when
I'm not going to judge.
dream big, you know? When I got to university, I started to realize I was more interested in writing. There was something happening at that time. I started to write and I started to see the power and the thing that it did for me. And I started to be less interested in kind of the show of it all and more interested in the story and what was happening in me and what I was thinking about. And so I transitioned to being like fully a writer. And when I went to do my master's in creative writing, I was mostly doing it just to write the book about my dad. And it wasn't until I really finished that book that I thought, oh, this isn't just a thing that I have that's a skill that I'm going to pick up and use and maybe put down. And, like painting, or for me, painting. Sometimes I paint, sometimes I don't, sometimes I draw, sometimes I don't. But for me, writing is like, it is always, these characters are always wandering around in my head. And every time a group leaves, a book is finished, new ones arrive. And so I really feel it's sort of my calling, and that's how I arrived at it.
Yeah, well, we're all glad that you realized that too. I mean, number one fan right here. So I think we have a few minutes for a couple of questions. We have some from Susan Gibson. Congrats on your book. Can you speak to Canadian authors who have inspired you? What book is on your bedside table? I love that.
So I just recommended on Q today. Is it on my desk? No. You Are Eating an Orange, and You Are Eating an Orange, You Are Naked by Sung King. So it's You Are Eating an Orange, You Are Naked. That's the name of the book that I just finished. I am now in the process of like deciding what book to read, but I'm also reading a translation. I'm always reading 3 books at a time. So just that's also like always a hardcover, an ebook, and an audiobook all at once, because I want a book wherever I am. If I'm driving in my car, if I'm by my bed, if I'm on the go. So I'm reading A Family Affair, which is a translation, and it's about messy couples, and I love it. I just love messy people. I love reading about people that are just hot, delicious messes. So that one's that. I'm actually listening to Gutter Child on audiobook, super vain probably, but I'm very much enjoying listening to Elamina talking back to me. And then hardcover, I'm actually reading Butter Honey Pig Bread in preparation for Canada Reads.
Right, great. Next one from M. Bai. Of your book stories, which story was the most difficult to write / tell?
Of the books I've written so far?
Yeah, books or stories. It's plural, so I'm going to say yes.
Tough call. I find children's books very difficult to write, despite being short. I don't know what I'm doing. And it's mostly like, it feels like university, where you sort of like writing in and giving it to the teacher and being like, is it right now? And then they give it back to you, they're like, no. And you're like, is it right now? But you don't really know what you're fixing. It's just kind of like a guessing game. That's how I feel children's books are. So those have been tricky to write for a different reason. Gutter Child by far was the hardest of all the books, though, just in terms of overall difficulty, because I had an idea, but I didn't really know what I was doing for about 4 years. I was playing around with like, what is the backstory? For a while, there was no backstory. It was just Elamina navigating all these problems and all these choices. And then, my editor, my agent was like, but why? What happened? Why is the world the way it is? I'm like,
why we have them.
So in the second half of working on the book, I was much more focused on like what led to it, what is really behind all of this. I had to answer those questions. And that became difficult because once I answered them, it kind of changed what was happening too. And so I felt like it's like building a house on wood beams and then trying to build the basement underneath it afterwards. It's a bad idea. It's a bad
Yeah,
order.
that does not sound advisable.
I would not advise it.
Yeah, no.
I'm hoping the sequel goes better because the basement is there, and I'm spending a lot of time thinking things through before I start plowing in.
That kind of sounds like, because as I read that question, I thought, you know what, I have a question too. So that kind of sounds like a little bit of answering how your process in building a world.
Yeah.
I know that's a big question, but
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't do it the way I did it. So what I would generally do, if I was giving a world building workshop, I would say, first of all, always make it about a question. I think if you make it like a mission statement, I want people to know X. I want people to know women's lives are hard. That's a recipe for disaster. I think you want to ask a question like, what happens if there are no women in the world, right? That's an interesting question. What happens if roles are reversed? What would women be doing now? Like those kinds of things are more interesting than just, let's say things are bad for women kind of thing. So ask yourself a question, and then I think really spend a lot of time building and talking about, I gather pictures. So like Livingstone Academy, there's a picture on my computer of what I think the entrance of Livingstone Academy looks like. There's a picture of Riverside. There's a picture of what I pictured the gutter to be like. And so I gather those pictures and then I start to sort of write out, who's the mayor and is it a president or a prime minister? Is it a king? You start asking those questions. Why did this happen? What's the backstory? Spend a lot of time on those kinds of things. And then also figure out what your driving plot is. And when you actually start writing, you should have a really good sense of, this is how I write. A really good sense of where you're going. There's some people who ramble in the process. They just sort of go wherever their writing takes them, and then it takes them a while, but they eventually get at the book. I'm not like that. I'm like obsessed with efficiency. So that's the efficiency model. Always write beginning to end, beginning to end. So always, when you do a draft, take it all the way to the ending, even though your first draft is terrible. And then in the second one, fill in the details. In the third one again, and just layers and layers. And that's how I'm working on the sequel. I'm on draft 2, almost at the end of draft 2. And so I have a full beginning, middle, and end. And so each layer is just correcting something that I didn't address in the layer before.
Right. Okay, so you clearly need to teach a workshop on world building, because I mean, like I need a spot right now, just so you know, reserve me a seat. I think we have time for one more question from Catherine Daly. Love your book, read it in 2 days. Same. I am a teacher in Kitchener and I'm always looking for new books to recommend to students. What grade level do you feel your book would be a good fit for?
It's a great question. It's like I planted this one. I think I think it's
Maybe you did.
appropriate for as young as grade 9. Like I would feel quite comfortable all the way to grade 9. There are conversations, especially in the Upper Grand District School Board, which I think you're part of, to actually put it into the curriculum sooner than I ever expected. I think some teachers are actually doing it this semester. When they're doing it in the schools, as I currently understand it, most of them are looking at doing it with grade 10s. Some schools grade 11s. There is also an educator guide that's in the process of being developed. It should be ready in the next week or so. And I don't think it's overstating to say it's a phenomenal educator guide. Like if I was I read it, I was like, can I do that assignment? Can I do that? There's really comprehensive, like a breakdown of assignments. And then what my favorite part of it is, especially if you're looking grade 9, grade 10, is there's a chapter by chapter breakdown of questions to get students thinking about some of the important issues. And it's actually being used as an anti-racism education tool. So a book to help push conversations about anti-Black racism.
Okay, that's exciting.
I know.
Wow.
They had these teachers working on it back in the fall. And when the
Wow.
first draft of the guide came together, I was like in tears because I just thought, I can't even imagine how it would have changed me to read something like that and have those kinds of conversations in grade 10. Like they're
Yeah.
connecting it to apartheid and asking questions about the African diaspora and how experiences of Blackness differ around the world, and looking into Langston Hughes, who's sort of like alluded to throughout the book, or his poetry is alluded to. And so just a really great resource. So yes, that.
Wow. Feel free to send me one just because I want to look at it. I have
I
a
think it'll be
couple of
once it comes
teacher
out,
friends.
it'll be digital. Yeah, it'll be right on
Okay.
the HarperCollins website.
I'll just
I'll
send it
put
to all my teacher friends. Here you go.
I feel like I was like, if you're doing a book club or if you're just reading it for fun, I feel like I would want to go back and pull it out and be like, chapter 1. Okay, yes.
Yeah. Okay, I want one then. Done. Take my money. I wonder if we have time for one more question. I think we probably do.
They can cut us off. It's fine.
Oh, that's true, right? So we're going to hijack the night. Shannon Addison, hi, JL, best-selling author Richardson. Congrats. Now that you're interacting with more and more people that have finished reading your novel, have you been surprised by anyone's interpretation of any of the characters?
So, I mean, I have to give the backstory behind Shannon. So Shannon is like one of our oldest friends, like as a family. She belongs to all of us. I can't actually claim her as my own because she's really my sister's best friend, and now I just want her to be my best friend. But she's
I love
also
it.
been a really keen supporter of the book from early on, like just wanted to read it so fast, shares it with everybody. So I love this question too, because it's a sign of like how carefully she read it. Yes, I have been surprised by people's interpretations of characters. Um, how do I say this? So I think I've been surprised the most by people's interpretation of the people on the hill and their
Mm,
response to them as a group. Over the course of the novel, you learn little bits of them along the way, and so I've been a little bit surprised at how people interpret that part of the story, which I find really interesting. And I will say, one of the things that I love is hearing people's interpretations, because I do, and I don't want to like, but I feel like people's interpretation of this book is helping me shape the next book. It's helping me understand either things that weren't clear or things that need to be things I can play on more, that I can pick up on.
right.
So that's been really interesting. I also had a question recently about Lewis and
Mm,
about the background behind Lewis's story, and it wasn't so much a misinterpretation of Lewis. It was more like, who was Lewis supposed to represent, and that led to a really interesting conversation.
all right. We just had a comment to one of the questions that you answered from teacher Catherine. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. Cannot wait to use that. I'm going to tell everyone thank you. So I just had to let you know that as well. One more question. Has the pandemic impacted the writing and storyline for the sequel?
Mm. The pandemic is just impacting everything. I feel like it's like a cloud you can't quite get away from. And even when you think like the sun's coming up on the other side of it, the sun just moves further away. um, so I don't think like I obviously not like a literal pandemic. I'm not so much into talking about it. I'm hoping by the time the book comes out, it doesn't exist and we'll forget about it almost. Um, I think more than that, I think the Black Lives Matter conversation, honestly, is the thing that's shaping it the most, and people's response to it. So Gutter Child came out in the midst of it. It was like ripe and it was hard and it was raw.
Mhm.
And now the sequel will kind of come on the tail of that, as people are maybe paying attention still, maybe not, as sort of that passion and drive and energy and enthusiasm is dwindling. And so I think it will be more about that kind of um,
Yeah.
what we do after, but also not what we do after, what we do in the midst. Because what I know is that this situation that we're in, the situation that gutter children are in the book, isn't going to change. And that's been something that's been really heavy on my mind. How do we change systems? Can systems change? That's like probably the thing that I'm most obsessed with right now. Can systems change? And if they
Yeah.
can change, how? If they can't change, what do you do about it?
Okay. So,
Nice light question to leave you all with.
oh my goodness. Oh, JL, this is amazing. I'm so grateful for this evening. And we are both so great. All of us are so grateful for all of the participants and all of these questions, and you being able to answer them so articulately. So I think we're going to go back to Sheila. Thank you so
Can I just
much.
say, I think Sheila's going to mention this, but I'll say it as well. I do have book plates that I will sign and send to you at your home. And so Sheila may have put it in the chat section already. But if you go to my website, the contact me page, you can put a message that you want, or you can just give me your address and I'll send it to you. That is
Yeah, it's been lovely having you back to Kitchener. So thank you so much for tonight.
all.
And Kelly and JL, thank you for your time, your conversation, and providing insight into Gutter Child, but holding back just enough since some of us are currently working on it or we're waiting for our copy to come in. The library owns 5 copies and there's 25 holds, and I know that number will go up after tonight. But as always, if you can, we invite you to buy a copy and support authors and bookstores. And as JL mentioned, she's offering to sign book plates, and I did give you the link in the chat. Just go to her website and the contact page. She'll sign it out. And don't forget to put your mailing address, please. JL is currently sitting at number 4 on the Globe and Mail bestseller list, out today. She's also on the CBC Canadian Fiction list, and she's 4th on the Toronto Star Canadian Fiction list. Her book is featured on Chapter's Indigo homepage for Black History Month. I had to go old school, in the company of Barack Obama and Angie Thomas. And Gutter Child is currently featured in Chatelaine and Zoomer magazines. JL, congratulations again, and all the love, the recognition, and the success you're receiving. It's so deserved and it's lovely. I would also like to take a minute and acknowledge that today is I Read Canadian Day. The purpose of this day is to raise awareness of Canadian books and celebrate the richness, diversity, and breadth of Canadian literature. Having JL as part of today's celebration is important because if you follow JL on Twitter or Instagram, and as she and Kelly touched on tonight, you know she uses her voice to be a fierce advocate for diverse authors and stories. And as she shared on Twitter in regard to this year's Canada Reads, she's currently snacking on the short list. She doesn't like one, but would fight to the death for 3 others. But she won't share which one. So you need to follow her and find out, because as she says, that is for the tea. If you weren't able to attend JL's virtual book launch in January, it is up on YouTube, and I invite you to go check it out for more conversation about Gutter Child and to see and feel her friends and her family and colleagues celebrating her. And to tonight's audience, we know that online events take a different kind of energy and commitment. So thank you for your time, your participation, and your questions, and choosing to spend some of your evening with us. I invite you to watch social media and our website for details about our 4th Fold Light event, coordinated and hosted by JL and her team. It will take place on April 28th, and full details will be out soon. So again, JL, Kelly, thanks so much for being with us tonight. Everybody have a great week, stay safe, and good night.
Thanks, Sheila. Thanks, KPO.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.